Okay, well, thank you very much, Morten, for being our speaker for today. I really appreciate you coming and speaking to us on the RMA and medium density housing. And yeah, we'll have, so Morten will speak for about 15 minutes and then we'll have some questions after that. So either you can put them in the chat for now or we can just come back to them after Morten's finished. So I'll let you just keep your time. Is that all right, Morten? Okay, cool. So over to you and thank you very much.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Becky. Thanks to you, Regan, and to Catherine for inviting or organizing these sessions and for inviting me. Kia ora koutou katoa, everyone. Ko Morten Gjerde tene. It's my privilege to talk to you today about some research that Becky and I have done. So Becky's involvement is not only as the facilitator today, but Becky is a collaborator with me and a number of research assistants who I'll acknowledge at the end. We were motivated to apply for some funding to look at the question of how the Resource Management Act affects the ability of the development industry to deliver medium density housing. For other than Herenga, I think most of us who are still in New Zealand will know that there's an ongoing housing crisis. And there's a lot to suggest that building more intensively is a great way to add to the numbers of houses that we need to address this problem. The so-called housing at higher densities or medium density housing still does encounter a number of barriers. And what I'll do now is maybe turn on my slides, which, ooh, what have I got here? Files. I'm not quite sure what's happening here, Becky. Can you make me the host?
Yep.
Or, yeah. I can't see my stuff.
Oh. Is that working?
Let's see. I'll back out of it. Apologies. We should have rehearsed this a little earlier.
If you click on your slides and then press share, does that work?
I've got my slides and window. Press share. It says system preferences, security, and privacy to grant access.
Oh. Are you able to email me the slides and I can share them?
Oh, wow.
Or are they quite big?
Morten, that seems to have ability for anyone to share screen. So if you click on the green button,
yeah.
It should share your screen.
Yeah, it's coming up with Dropbox, Microsoft Drive.
No, click on the green button in the middle of the...
Yeah, I have, Nigel, thank you. I've just clicked on share screen and come to Dropbox, Microsoft OneDrive, Google Drive, and Box.
Oh. Are your slides on your desktop?
Yeah. Oh, this is kind of so yeah.
Is it still saying that?
Yeah. Let me see. It says now advanced screen sharing options. Who can share? I can't seem to find the...
Morten, you should see a screen that looks something like this. Is that right?
It may have been...
And what you want to do is, if I click on annotate, you want to just click on the one I'm circling. Oh,
Oh,
he's disappeared.
he has. Okay, who's got a joke?
He'll reappear.
Technology does somehow have that ability to make all of us involved in teaching somehow appear incompetent, even then when we're not. Right? It's at the most stressful time too. You got to feel for
I know.
Morten.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, fantastic. You there, Morten? We can see your slides, but
You're not mute. You're muted at the minute, Morten.
Yeah, is that better?
yes, we can hear you. Great.
Okay, apologies and thanks for your patience, everyone. So there have been earlier studies looking at the influence of the RMA on ability to deliver medium density housing. For example, the Urban Task Force in 2008 found that regulatory costs, timeframes, and financial costs upfront for developers were limiting their ability. They also found, quite interestingly, that RMA would limit the extent to which the benefits of development, and of course, we're hearing about how housing at higher densities is a potential benefit to society by using infrastructures more effectively and creating stronger social and economic contexts for our cities. Later then, Ansel and Thompson-Fawcett, as well as Boffa-Miskell, found that the process was leading to poor design outcomes, largely because of the application in applying some of the district plan rules and evaluation processes. Often designs were dumbed down in that process in order to navigate through the consenting process. The Productivity Commission, which was really looking at affordability, identified a key factor there as the council-imposed barriers to intensification in existing residential areas, that was driving up costs both of land as well as of the cost to develop. Caroline Miller and Marilyn Higgins have both written about the Resource Management Act more broadly. They have argued, and particularly Marilyn Higgins in 2010, argued that the RMA is really situated in notions of colonial individualism, and that this, by default, leads to low density development. Perhaps taking account of previous studies, as well as the input from the development industry, the previous Conservative government, undertook changes to the Resource Management Act in 2009, 2013, 2017. And one of the reasons why we were interested in now looking at it again is, what effect have these updates to the Resource Management Act perhaps led to in the way councils consider medium density housing? So we worked with a research question: what are the specific challenges with resource consent processes, and how do they affect medium density housing? We undertook a three-pronged methodology. Firstly, we looked at the district plans of 5 towns and cities in the country, a little bit different to previous studies that have largely been focused on one city. We looked up and down the country. I'll identify those cities to you shortly. We also then worked with objective data around the timeframes that were being taken to process those consents in those 5 cities. And then finally, armed with our findings from the first 2 stages, we identified a number of projects that were interesting to us and set out to interview the project participants, namely the designer, the developer, and the processing planner, in order to get a more holistic, comprehensive, perhaps circumspect view of how these processes were playing out. If I look at Wellington, and this is a very brief presentation of the findings. Wellington, during the year that we investigated, processed 37 consents for medium density housing, a surprisingly low number when you think about the pressures for housing here in the capital. Of those, only 1 was notified. 26 were processed within 20 days, as we can see here. Just as a context for those who aren't as familiar with the Resource Management Act and how it's meant to enable development, there's an expectation that applications will be turned around and determined within 20 working days. But of course, a number of factors arise in their processing, and councils are enabled to extend those timeframes if circumstances deem it and the applicant agrees. And so for many of the applications, the timeframes were extended beyond 20 days through a so-called Section 37 extension. So of the 26 that were processed within 20 working days, 11 then were processed in more than 20 days. But in all, the 37 consents that were processed in Wellington did get processed within the statutory time frame, i.e. 20 working days or less, or 20 working days plus 37. However, when we look at the figures for number of days that those consent applications were put on hold, the picture changes, and on the right side of the screen, we see that a small number were processed within an actual 20 working days, and for the rest, those timeframes were extended to the point where an average of 77 working days was required to obtain resource consent for medium density housing in Wellington in the year that we looked at. Moving on to Auckland, we can see a similar front loading of the timeframes when we consider only the statutory timeframes. 383 consents were granted for multi-unit developments. In Auckland, they don't distinguish between multi-unit and medium density, so there may be a little bit of inaccuracy in the numbers that we're considering here, but 383 consents were granted. Only 1 of those went to a hearing. There was an average of 37 working days to statutory days, I meant statutory days to process and grant. 40% of the consents were granted in 20 days or less, whereas another 41% had their timeframes extended. And only 19% were not processed within the statutory limit timeframes. Now that's 19% more than Wellington's. Wellington's were processed within the statutory timeframes. However, you might recall that the timeframes were actually extended by numbers of days that the projects put on hold. Similar picture in Auckland, where the right-hand graph here shows the number of days that combined statutory plus days on hold were required for a consent to be granted. All up, 90 business days or 90 working days was required to uplift a consent for an average project in Auckland. That's 18 weeks. And we can start seeing straight away that based on Wellington and Auckland, Christchurch will be the same, that there are different perspectives perhaps in timeframes when it comes to RMA processing. In Christchurch, by that I meant that from the public's perspective, 20 days is 20 days, and anything more than 20 days is too long. Whereas from a council's perspective, they understand that the 20 days can be added to with a Section 37. And if an applicant puts their application on hold for any number of reasons, that doesn't cut into their statutory processing timeframes. In Christchurch, on the current screen here, we can see that 143 applications were processed in the year. 89% of all applications were put on hold for 1 or more working days. 2/3, this is quite unique to Christchurch, 2/3 of all the decisions around medium density housing projects in Christchurch were made by independent commissioners on behalf of council. And to the research team, that suggested, and we were informed later by the respondents to our interviews, that suggested that in Christchurch there is a severe allergy to taking on risk, and giving the decision making over to commissioners doesn't absolve the council from that, but it makes that decision making process appear more robust and less a factor owing to Christchurch's own staff. Taking all the timeframes in Christchurch, 20 weeks would be necessary to obtain a resource consent for medium density housing. So we looked at Wellington, Auckland, Christchurch. Hastings and Palmerston North were our other towns that we looked at. I'm not presenting that information today, just due to time constraints, but our objective really was to look at not only the towns and cities where medium density housing is undergoing or has the highest demand, such as Christchurch and Auckland, Christchurch at the time, less so now, but also in the smaller provincial towns where medium density housing is yet to emerge as a big factor in the development process, i.e. Palmerston North and Hastings. In summary, and this was looking at the district plans as well as the consent processing timeframes, it seems that that councils are working outside those set down in the legislation. Led us to question whether those timeframes are in fact realistic. There is, as I said earlier, multiple perceptions of time, and developers need to carry the development costs through the period of uncertainty, and that comes up again in the interviews that we conducted. Finally, and this is perhaps looking at other researchers or if this idea of looking at medium density housing holistically through objective data that's meant to be collected by councils, we found that there was a huge variance in the data that were collected, which made for a very difficult process of evaluation on the part of the research team. We really had to distill things down to get to a point where we could compare apples to apples, and it probably has left a few outliers at the edges, unable to be considered. I suppose the key takeaway from this graphic would be the total days across the board necessary for getting a consent for medium density housing listed here, compared again back to the expectation that this would be granted in 20 working days. Moving on, we conducted 24 interviews with a number of respondents in the 5 cities. We did speak to developers, architects, designers, and council planners. We weren't in every case able to speak to those 3 participants around a particular project, but we felt we were able to cover the RMA process from three different perspectives quite comprehensively. What were the key findings from this part of the process? One, and let's not be too critical about the process. There are some things that are working very well, and one is that it brings together a number of experts who are all focused on improving the quality of the outcomes from their perspective, of course, on a particular project in its particular setting and with the issues that arise because of that. There is potential in the RMA to be flexible around the application of district plan rules and policies. However, as we'll see, that is often avoided in favor of applying the rules for a number of reasons. And despite everything we read in the media, the actual cost of obtaining planning approval is not prohibitive to the developers. What is prohibitive is the uncertainty that comes with applying for resource consent and the variability of the way those processes are applied in the jurisdictions that we looked at. So a number of things are working well, but as I foreshadowed in the previous slide, the district plans include a number of rules, and while the RMA is open to flexibility in the way policies and rules are applied, in many cases the councils were seen to, and by their own admission, default to development rules, in part because of a fear of taking on risk, in part because of the inexperience of the staff who are assessing an application. And one experienced council planner made the comment that the rules are there to really lift the bottom line. And while that may be the case, it may help. Others that we spoke to felt that those rules could limit the potential of a lot of well-intentioned projects. There's variability and subjectivity in the assessment. Where rules don't apply, or even where they do, the interpretation of those rules according to the motivations, the experience of the assessor, whether it's the urban design assessor, the traffic assessor, can be variable. And the goalpost, if you like, or the target for a project was often found to change from pre-application phase to the application, in most cases because of a change in personnel. And it came to light through our discussions with council planning staff through these interviews that there is a fair churn of planning staff as council staff become familiar with their district plan. They then become more valuable to the development industry and are in many cases attracted to leave council for consulting jobs. And the key issue that came up in light of that was that councils found it very difficult to work through a CPD process to address subjectivity through training. The staff that they would prefer to work with to help them navigate subjectivity issues were often leaving before those CPD or training processes could be completed. There was a sense that the central government was failing to lead on MDH, while it was acknowledged across the country that medium density housing was necessary in part to address the housing shortages. Councils felt they were left to their own to pursue or to work with developers in the context of district plans that have been written to really foreground lower density housing in terms of the effects that are created on adjoining properties. and that it takes quite some time to change district plans. And councils themselves were asking for more leadership from central government on applying higher density in their evaluations. But of course, since then, the central government has come out with since our field work, the central government has come out with 2 urban development policy statements, the second of which subsumed the first, which was really looking at capacity. And the second one was released in July this year, and we hope that it will go some way in helping councils to evaluate medium density housing a little bit more open-mindedly. There's also variability in district plans up and down the country, and a number of developers are working in different locations. They found it frustrating to work with these variable district plans. They did acknowledge that each town or city had unique characteristics that could be and should be highlighted in district plans, and local residents should be able to determine how they best see their town develop in the future. But it was actually the format of the district plans, the way the rules are written, the way the policies are written, that developers and architects found to be frustrating. The conclusions from our study were that the RMA changes that were undertaken by the previous Conservative government were not sufficient in addressing the underlying difficulties that developers felt they were facing. The specific issues that came up in our consultation with the participants in medium density housing projects were that long time frames were necessary to obtain planning approval. There was variability in expert opinions, and that led to a number of uncertainties that really did put the development model at risk, the development model under pressure, and often led to changes that were in the views of the architects and developers, serving to dumb down the potential of their projects. That certainly was reflected also in the way the prescriptive rules were being applied. Leadership is needed and probably continues to be necessary at national level. We know that overseas governments take stronger leadership role in the way development policies are applied at local level. And many of our respondents raised that in their conversations with us. Finally, I'd just like to refer you to the report that was produced from this research. Acknowledge my co-author, Becky Kittle, acknowledge the funding from brands, and most importantly, acknowledge the great assistance that we had from a number of research assistants. They're all acknowledged in the report, but they brought an incredible open-mindedness, creativity to this project and others that we've worked with them on that we hope to present at future seminars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Morten. That was great. Thank you very much. Any questions? We're at 1:30, but if maybe we have time for a couple of questions, if that's all right. And obviously people might need to leave, but any questions?
Yeah, Morten, thanks for that presentation. It was really succinct and valuable. I was interested in the time taken, and I note also that there is a gaming of the rules that local authorities engage in, and for example, they always operate on a callback system. It might be a week, if you're lucky, often, to get a call back, and then they'll decide that there's somebody else and they'll call you back. And right, so there's all these sorts of silly things that go on that really extend the resource consent processes but don't appear in the data. I'm curious, did any of those sorts of issues start to arise from your architect, designer, developer stream of consultation?
Hey, thanks, Mark. And obviously, your question is from is made from experience, and probably each of us tuning in today have got our own specific experiences of navigating these resource consent or building consent processes. What we've highlighted in the findings of the research are really those that have been the strongest, if you like, in our analysis of the transcripts of the interviews. I would, without having all of those transcripts in front of me, I would venture to guess that a number of the points that you've raised will have come up from the individuals, and they probably underlie the reasons for the extended timeframes and the sense of frustration that a lot of our respondents communicated. We haven't highlighted them as specific issues, certainly not in this presentation. Perhaps in the report, you might find evidence of that. Yeah.
Morten, can I ask about the other side? It seems what your data would suggest is 20 days is too short, full stop, anyway. But what about on the other side? Are the applicants also gaming the system, putting in underprepared proposals that require extensions and then blaming the system for that?
Now, that's a really interesting question, and thank you, Nigel. That, I can assure you, did come up in our interviews on a number of occasions from planners. I think maybe refer to Becky here, but my recollection is that came up from a number of planning respondents in the interviews. Definitely, that is an issue.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the RFI process that Mark made, I guess, referred to in his question, is one that enables the council to obtain further clarification. I think the system has, I guess, been fine-tuned to, or is being fine-tuned to try to work with what you're referring to, Nigel, which is that applications are underdeveloped or under resourced. Councils have the ability to reject an application, both at building consent, but in this case at resource consent level. And my experience outside this particular process is that they're looking more carefully at that.
Just to clarify, Morten, I wasn't talking about an RFI process. I was talking about, I guess, professionalism is the wrong word, but the fact that it's not a contestable process. You cannot, there's actually no accountability for council performance. They can, and in fact, some consultants would argue that because it's on a chargeback basis, in fact, there's a reverse there. There's an incentive for it to take longer, right? So certainly there's sometimes the experience that you're dealing with untrained staff, that you're educating, that you are helping councils using the system because they don't have enough staff, for instance. So there might only be one person available to answer a certain realm of knowledge. So if it takes that person a week to respond to a call, That's just the way they manage their system. Whereas in the private sector, that would be seen as poor performance.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think that has come up in some of the literature, particularly those looking at design review processes, the sort of political weight and inequality that comes up in these more subjective processes like design review. You're right, councils do hold the leverage, and there is no alternative consultant, if you like, or alternative counsel to go to. We have to get our approvals from the local authority. And so, no, you're absolutely right that is an issue. Part of it may come from a lack of resourcing, as you say. We know that councils it was expressed to us on a number of occasions that one of the reasons that staff are leaving is that they can't afford to pay the staff what they can in the consultant world. Councils are being under-resourced. They seem to be between the rock and the hard place, lifting their income in order to be able to have a higher capacity is anathema also to the ratepayers.
Great. Any final questions or? No? Okay, well, thank you very much, Morten. That was fantastic. And appreciate your time to present today. Next week, we've got Phil Morrison, Professor Phil Morrison, who's Emeritus Professor in Urban Geography at Vic, and he's talking about loneliness. So quite a different topic, but the geography of loneliness and happiness, conversely. So I think that'll be an interesting one to clock into next week, 1 p.m, same time, same place. Cool. Awesome. Have a good rest of your week, everybody, and see you then.